My name's Katie Fleming. I'm a staff member at the Hearst Museum of Anthropology and the host of today's show. Ask an Archaeologist is a series of live-streamed interviews co-hosted by the Archaeological Research Facility and the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology, both located at the University of California, Berkeley. During each program, we interview a UC Berkeley affiliated archaeologist and answer audience questions. And today I'm speaking with archaeologist and also my colleague at the Hearst Museum, Paolo Pellegatti. Hi, Paolo. How are you?
Hi, Katie. Nice to see you today.
Yeah, good to see you too. But before we get started, I wanted to let you know how you can submit your questions online during today's program. So if you have a question that you want to ask, you can go to a website called Slido. So you type in sli.do/askarf or ASKARF. And then, or you can just type in Ask ARF to the Slido website and click on join and type in your question there. And we'll be receiving those questions throughout the course of the show and answering them as we can. And the link is also in the description for this video. If you just look down below, you can click on that link to ask questions, and we'll remind you again of the link partway through the interview. So Paolo, who I'm speaking with today, is a research archaeologist at the Hearst Museum of Anthropology. And after graduating with a degree in archaeology from the University of Venice, he came to Berkeley to join the PhD program in anthropology. In 2007, he was hired by the Hearst Museum, moving from one side of Kroeber Plaza to the other, to Kroeber Hall, where we work together today. And Paolo worked in archaeological excavations in Northern Italy and Croatia, but hasn't been in the field since starting work at the Hearst Museum as a researcher. So firstly, I want to say thank you so much for being with us today, Paolo.
Thank you for the invitation, Katie.
So I thought you could start off by telling us a little bit about your work. What do you do and how did you get into the field of archaeology and museum research that you're in now?
Well, I got into the field of archaeology quite accidentally, I would have to say. I was already an undergrad in college in Venice, and I always had an interest in history and archaeology, but I was planning for a degree in art history. But one day, as I was walking around the department, I just spotted a new class that just opened that day, and I went inside, and that class was prehistoric archaeology, and that gave me a sense of archaeology that I didn't have before, because I was associating archaeology to the classical period when I was an undergrad, and I didn't really have a strong interest in the classical period. But when I saw this class about archaeology, prehistoric archaeology, it opened up a universe. I was like, oh, I would like to do this. And there started, and then I finished my classes in Venice. And after I moved here, I started to develop the sense that I would like to work in a museum and curate archaeological collections. This is in part of my historical interest from before, and in part also because when I was in the field, I was known to be a rather slow excavator. That thing kind of followed me over the years, especially in my latest excavations. My Croatian friends were really always telling me, like, Paolo, could you please speed up? And I was, according to them, I was fiddling a little too much. And so I started to, think, okay, maybe the pace of a field excavation is too much for me. And then I started to develop the idea that I would be really enjoy working in a museum where you curate all their collection. I think by the time I came to Berkeley, I already submitted in one of my proposals this dream of mine to be working in a museum. Of course, back in the days, I didn't think that that museum would be the Hearst Museum. And so when I came to the Hearst Museum, I faced the large number of archaeological collections that we have. And I sort of had to start a little retraining myself to a new reality of having to deal with collections from all over the planet, rather than geographically more defined area that I was used to, and therefore meant studying a lot of archaeology from different places in order to be better able to curate the collections that we have at the Hearst Museum. So in conjunction and with in collaboration with our colleagues from the collection department, we curate this large collections of the Hearst Museum. Our colleagues and friends collection managers do curate the objects more from a physical perspective, from a physical point of view. They curate, that they are in good shape, that they are protected, that they are conserved. And I looked at the same objects from a slightly different angle, from their provenience for the associated documentation that we have in our archives, and all together, all our colleagues at the museums are trying to curate these collections and preserve them the best we can for the next generation to come, which is one of our goals. But working in a museum, make sure that the next generation will enjoy the same access to this archaeological collections that we enjoy today.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. And just for our viewers who are more at an introductory level to archaeology, can you define for them, you mentioned that the collection staff at the museum protect the physical nature of the objects, want to make sure that they are well protected from the elements, from people, from whatever else. But you're working on kind of the data and the information around these. And you mentioned a word, provenience. Could you define for our viewers what that means?
Well, the provenience of an archaeological object is, in short, basically the location from where this object was first excavated and found, and especially the relationship of this particular object with all the other objects within an archaeological site, and that create the context. Now, of course, the context is of paramount importance for archaeology because, well, a rock, sometimes it's just a rock. A rock that is in the context of a fireplace, for example, is no longer just a rock, but it's a rock that was placed there on purpose by someone in order to create a structure and things of this sort. And as Jordan kindly recalled the other day, last week, archaeology is a destructive enterprise. And therefore, you as an archaeologist, at the very moment you excavate an object or a site, you are the first and the last person to see this object in the original context and the site before you actually destroy it. And therefore, it is important, as again, as Jordan very kindly reminded the other day, it is important to write down and record and register everything you do before you remove this object from its original location. Now, 20 years later, sometimes the information about the object is the relationship with between the objects and the documentation can be a little more tenuous, and therefore one of the aspects of my job is to make sure that we save and curate those documentation in order to be able to tell for every object that we have where it's from, who collected it, why it was collected, and how it was collected, and why is it now at the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you bring up those questions of what is this? Where did it come from? How did it get from where it was from to here? Because I feel like these are really important questions in terms of an archaeological collection at a museum, but also for any kind of data that we're encountering. These objects are information, and for us to make sure that we know, what is this information? How did I get it? Who brought it here? What is its place in the context of other things is a really important lesson to learn in many different fields. Yes, so we have an audience question that I was wondering if you could answer, which I think you've kind of touched on already, but They're asking, how important is context in regards to curating at the Hearst Museum, and how do you work to maintain this information when you have such a diverse collection?
It is so the relationship between documentation and the objects, as we said, very important. The collections of the Hearst Museum have been collected, since its founding, and archaeology has been central to the history of the Hearst Museum and its development over the last more than 100 years. If you think about the original, what we consider to be the original Hearst Museum collections, the one that were sponsored and paid by Phoebe Hearst at the beginning of the last century, archaeology was the core of, with the Yuli expedition in Peru, with the Reisner expedition in Egypt, with the Emerson expedition in Europe. Archaeology was at the core of the foundation of the Hearst Museum. And all these early explorers did leave manuscripts and maps and notes, and in addition to the publications that they eventually produced over the years. And so this creates the context within the museum that I am trying, with the help of all my colleagues, of course, we're trying to preserve. It's not the reality of archaeological museums in archaeological collections in museums is that sometimes they are divided between different institutions, between different places, and therefore every museum needs to find a way to make known their collection in ways so they can be related to other the same collection from other museums. So what we're trying to do in order to be able to safely maintain the documentation in association with the object for the future is to be, we've been digitizing a lot of our archives over the years, and therefore we've been able to save for future generations the original manuscripts that are now just as important as the objects from an historical and anthropological perspective.
Mm-hmm. And we're getting a question from one of our viewers. Hopefully many people know that the Hearst Museum's collections are available online and searchable via our website. But we're getting a question as to whether some of the old maps and notes, or this archival, this background information giving context to the objects, is also available online currently.
Yes, and thank you for the questions. And in order to answer, I would like to give a lot of credit to one of our colleagues, Dr. Michael Black, who more than 10 years ago told me that his goal was to be able to make the entire collections of the Hearst Museum available to the public. And now we can safely say that the public can browse our entire collections through the use of our portal. I will be showing maybe the portal URL later. When it comes to documentation, the original documentation, it is available to a number of our constituents, to a number of our stakeholders, and I'm talking about tribal entities, for example. They are very interested in when it comes to the California and North American archaeological record. They're very interested in the associated documentation, but especially for researchers, and especially also for researchers. These documents, these resources are available, but they're not available online. They are available by appointment.
Cool, thanks for sharing that. And I think you had some images and some other information that you were hoping to share with our viewers for today.
Yes, I would,
right?
since today was a chat for trying to open up to a larger audience our collections, I was just trying to find a few examples of the many things you can find through our portal, just giving a sense to our audience about the breadth of the collections at the Hearst Museum. And so let me just briefly share a few images, and I will just say a few things about the images that are going to be on the monitor. Here's a picture, and a picture from probably 1919, 1919, of the original storage space for the museum when it was still located in San Francisco. And as you can see, it's already full of archaeological material. You can recognize some manos and metates, probably from South California. You can see some Egyptian mummies and figurines and statues in the background, and two researchers working on the collections. One of the things about the Hearst Museum is that we do have archaeological collections from around the world, and some of these collections are incredibly beautiful and incredibly important. Here's an example from an archaeological site in Mali that dated back to about 4,000 years ago. And this is a beautiful workshop that includes beautiful burins and beautiful little drills that were used to work on those agate beads that you see. And as you can see, one in the corner, one of the agate beads was turned into a little teeny tiny arrowhead. Another site, an archaeological site in Sudan, more or less of the same age, 4,000, 4,500 years ago, and these are gaming pieces and pottery from gaming pieces from a game that we don't know how it was played, of course. Another one of my favorite collections is the University of California African expedition that was done in 1948 and 1949, and a team of researchers from the University of California went across the continent from north to south, and these are lithic flakes and tools that were found in a cave in South Africa. You can tell that I love stone tools and lithics. Closer to home, this is a beautiful example of one of the few excavations that we have from Italy. We have a number of objects from Italy, but they were mostly bought on the antiquarian market. But we do have one spectacular example of an Etruscan site that was excavated in 1911. And this is a beautiful example of one of those excavations. Going back in time, but staying in Europe, this is a very nice, incredibly nice incised bone from a cave in southern France, in the same region where all the famous painted caves are found. One of the important pieces, and an example of what I mentioned before, one of the situations I mentioned before. Sometimes excavations were divided by different institutions, and now there are multiple museums around the world that have samples from the same excavation. This is, for example, is a beautiful scraper from Tabun Cave, which is in Israel. And it was excavated in 1935 by Dorothy Garrod, who was the first female professor of anthropology at University of Cambridge. And she was helped by one of our own, Theodore McCown, and this site is about 120,000 years old, and one of the first examples of a Neanderthal site. Theodore McCown went in 1969 in India, for example, where he excavated this beautiful quartzite microlith. All of these little tools, by the way, for member of our audience that are less accustomed to archaeological material, all of these little flakes here were made this way. That they're not little flakes. They're you know, broken quartzite pieces. All of these are retouched to be the way that they are right now that we found them. One of the examples of our archives at the museum, this is a photo from 1902. The person that you see in the background is Dr. Jones, and this is Dr. Philip Jones, and this is one of the original excavation from 1901 in the Tulare Valley down in the California Central Valley, and you can see the extent of the old archaeological site and the trench that they excavated in 1902. Of course, the museum is also the repository for the beautiful archaeological material that comes from the Bay Area shell mounds, and this is an incredibly nice scapula bone saw. As you can see, all the dents that were created, and for example, this tool is, if you can see closely, you can probably see some glossy patina that is along the worked edge, which is normally a sign that a tool like this was used to reap grasses that could be used and collected for making baskets, the famous basketry from California native populations. This is another beautiful example. Just like the African, these are microliths that were used in the Channel Islands down in California, Channel Islands of California. This for the specialized production of shell beads.
Thank you for showing us all these images. I wanted to take a moment to pause here too, to just let our visitors know, our viewers know about some nice connections to some of the images that you've shown in the other episodes of this YouTube series. So I really appreciate, Paolo, you showing us the breadth of the collections that the Hearst Museum houses. And if you were interested in any of the things that you've seen so far and curious about finding out more, for example, we had an episode in this series about collaborative archaeology in Sudan, which speaks to some of the Sudanese material, an episode about Etruscan material, if that's something you're interested in. And we have an episode coming up next week that's going to be about some work related to the cave sites with paintings in them that Paolo mentioned as being related to some of the collections that were shown. And then also about some contemporary collaborative archaeological projects in California, which might have parallels with some of the collections that you've seen here too. So this is kind of like the tips of many icebergs, Paolo, that you're showing us right now.
Absolutely, it would be impossible, in a very short period of time to be able to show so many of the beautiful archaeological objects that we have. We're trying very hard, and we actually succeeded in many aspects. Of course, all the images I'm showing today can be found through our portal, but I wanted to show this one because this one is probably the northernmost object that we have in our collection. This is from Alaska, from Point Barrow. And going south in South America, a beautiful collection from Venezuela island off the coast, off of the northern coast of Venezuela, that was excavated in the 60s. So
thank you for sharing all those. Those were great, and I can tell that our viewers are excited, and we have a few more questions, not necessarily specifically related to the pieces that you've shown, but hopefully those questions will come in. I want to remind our viewers that if you want to ask a question, you can head to slido/askarf. So that's sli.do/askarf. But in the short term, we have a question here from one of our audience members. You're talking a lot about the museum curation that you've done, and I can tell that you've just gained a wealth of information over the years that you've been at the Hearst Museum about all these collections. And one of our viewers is asking, what do you miss about fieldwork, if anything, and what do you like or dislike about curating at the museum versus fieldwork?
What I miss of fieldwork? What I miss of fieldwork is the community. And that is 100%. I went to excavation places where I was an undergrad and for more than 15 years. And I have really good memories of all the people that I met over the years in different places in Turkey, in Croatia, in Italy, and other places. So I do miss the community. I do miss the excitement in a way of finding something. But curating collections in a museum presents its own set of challenges, and there is no. I'm not sure how to answer that question. I love looking at old objects. There are people like me that are really in touch with material culture. We like physical objects. And being surrounded by all of these objects that I can learn about was always one of my dream. And it definitely came through at the Hearst Museum.
We have one more question coming in, which is actually directed at both of us, and I think maybe we can speak to different aspects of it. The question is, could you explain how the museum's archaeological collections have been mobilized for education? And I think I can probably answer a little bit of that about our K-12 audiences, but Paolo, maybe you have some insight kind of over the long term about how these collections have been leveraged for university audiences, and then I can speak to K-12.
Well, this museum was founded as a research institution. For a number of years, this museum, the Hearst Museum, did not have a public gallery, even though public viewing started very early. The idea behind the foundation, one of the ideas behind the foundation of the museum and Phoebe Hearst's dream, was a museum for all the people in California to learn about the history of our state and the history of and anthropology around the world. So since the very beginning, it was basically mandatory for the museum to open up some rooms for the public to come in. And I know that in 1911, for example, when they opened the first time, I believe, they only had 2 rooms, and they were changing like a bunch of objects every 3 weeks or every month, and just let the people go inside and peruse. But the idea was that this is just for researcher, a bit ivory tower, as used to be said back in the days. And the reality is that the museum collected so much material very quickly after its foundation that it became basically almost impossible for the museum to be able to show everything the museum had since the very beginning. The first time the museum complains with the university about the storage space is, I believe, in 1917. And they started to say, oh, we need more space. Something that we keep hearing today.
Yeah.
So
yeah, but I think that's.
And the collections are open to researchers. They're open to a number of our audiences and stakeholders. Of course, you don't have to be a PhD student to be able to come. But the reality is, it's impossible for us to completely open the collections to the public the way we would like to.
And probably the online portal is closest that we've gotten that in recent years, but we're constantly working on it in different ways. And like Paolo said, there's there's many levels of educational access to these collections. So it's not just if you're a PhD level researcher, but we also have opportunities for undergraduate research assistants who are an integral part of our museum's operations. Those are huge educational opportunities for them, as well as undergraduate student staff who are assisting day-to-day operations and research and education. And then as far as K-12 audiences go, and class visits, university classes are coming all the time into the Hearst Museum's collections when classes are in session, to come and get in-person experience with the collections at the kind of direction of their faculty instructor, who might be a subject area specialist in what we're looking at. And then for K-12 audiences, we run a professional development program for teachers to help empower them to teach with collections and learn how to use objects as primary sources, and have other kinds of educational resources on our website that people can use either from home or in the classroom to bring the things that researchers like Paolo are and other researchers coming to the museum are learning about the collections into the classroom in a way that people of different ages can understand. So thank you, that's a great question. And I think we probably just have time for one more kind of broad takeaway question. What do you listen from archaeology today, and from your particular type of work? What do they stand to learn from this type of work?
You were a little bit breaking up there, your voice.
Oh no, okay.
But so could you please repeat the question?
Sure, yeah. So the question was just, what do you hope our listeners take away from the type of archaeological work that you do in a museum? What do you hope they might learn from this talk today?
Well, I hope that a lot of our audience will go away knowing that the Hearst Museum is doing its best to preserve what was given to the University of California for future generations. Especially when it comes to the archaeology of our own state. We know California is one of the richest states in the Union. It's been developed over many years, and a lot of the archaeological record has been unfortunately destroyed. And therefore, I hope that people know that when things were entitled to the Hearst Museum, we will do our best to preserve them for the next generation of people that are interested in archaeology, that have an interest in history also, and enjoy the many stories that these archaeological collections can tell us. Again, archaeology doesn't tell one story, it tells many stories. And this variety of stories is one of the things that is most interesting about the discipline of archaeology and anthropology, even in 2020.
Well, thank you. That was a great takeaway. And I want to thank you so much for being here today, Paolo. And I also wanted to thank our viewers and those who submitted such great questions to us today. And I hope that some of you will be able to join us for the next episode in the Ask an Archaeologist series, which is going to be tomorrow, Wednesday, May 13th at noon, when John Holson of Pacific Legacy will be speaking in a talk entitled Job Opportunities in the Private Sector, Cultural Resource Management. So thank you again, Paolo, for being here today. And I
thank you for the invitation, Katie.
Rest of your day. Bye.
Bye-bye.